In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is the Roundhouse.
Our guest today is an author, primarily children's author, whose series God's Wonderful Railway became a BBC television production in 1980. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mrs. Avril Rowlands.
Hello, nice to be here.
It's so great to have you on the show, Avril, because this is a series that 6 months ago, being a US resident, I'd never heard of. I gather it has quite the cult following in the UK, but being that a lot of us here are from the US, can you provide us an overview of what God's Wonderful Railway is?
Well, the name God's Wonderful Railway actually is a sort of a warm way of calling the Great Western Railway, which was one of the great railway companies in the UK. The series was made by the BBC. There are 8 half-hour episodes covering 3 different generations, 3 periods in history of the same railway family. It was based on a preserved steam railway in the UK, in the Midlands, called the Severn Valley Railway, and I adhered fairly strictly to the history of the railway when I was writing the series. So that's it in a nutshell. The first 2 stories were about the line being built in the 1860s. Then the middle 3 stories were about the railway in its Edwardian heyday. Interestingly, I wanted to write a series about the Victorian era, but had to work around what actual railway artifacts, what steam engines, what rolling stock there was on the Severn Valley Railway at the time. And there wasn't really anything Victorian, so we had to use Edwardian. So I wrote that particular section on the Edwardian heyday in 1906. And then the third 3 episodes were at the start of the Second World War. I also actually wrote another 2 stories, which the BBC commissioned and paid for, but due to various financial constraints, sadly, they never made, which was the closing of the line and then the reopening in the 1970s as a preserved steam railway, but those sadly were never made. So it covers 3 different periods in history of the same railway family. That's it in a nutshell.
My understanding is that you wrote this with the intention of it being a screenplay, which then was picked up, and then it was later published as books. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a slightly odd way around because usually, or generally, the book's written, somebody from television or some production company thinks, oh, that make a good screenplay. So then either the writer of the book or a screenwriter is engaged to actually turn it into a television series. For me, it was the other way around. I was working in television at the time at the BBC, and I wrote, first of all, I wrote 3 episodes, a simple story, gave it to a producer who said, yes, go away and develop it. She also said, had you actually seen a film, The Titfield Thunderbolt? Because my story was about a baddie railway company, a baddie bus company who was trying to take over from the railway company. I'd never seen the Titfield Thunderbolt, but the producer, Anna Hume, who ended up being the executive producer on the series, said, well, it's a good idea. You've got some good ideas there. Go away and rethink it. So I did, and it ended up as God's Wonderful Railway. I was very lucky. I was in the right place at the right time.
Oftentimes, that's how these things transpire. In
Yeah.
general, what got you interested in becoming an author?
I've always liked writing. The first book I had published was actually a technical book on the job I used to do in television, which was that of continuity script supervisor. I was working in BBC Children's Drama Department, and in the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, they produced some extremely good children's drama. I was working on a book adaptation of a book called Carrie's War. Some of the scenes were set, actually filmed on the Severn Valley Railway. So I went off with the crew to film these scenes. And my husband, who also worked at the BBC at the time, he was an editor, a film editor, we wanted to make a film as the two of us as a sort of busman's holiday. Anyway, I got to meet the chief engineer of the railway. I'll explain how, if you like, in a minute, which is quite funny. Suggested that we might make a publicity film for them, and that's how I really sort of started getting an interest in railways. But how it actually happened was interesting because we were filming a passing shot of the train for the opening title sequence with the train passing the camera left to right. So the whole crew, we all piled into one of the compartments. The train stopped. We all got out, climbed over a fence into a field, walked up the field. The train backed out. It then went through. We took several passing shots. We then all went down, climbed over the fence, and I'm quite short, and I found I actually wasn't tall enough to get back into the compartment. So the driver said, "Would you like a lift on the footplate?" I didn't realize that this was, really quite something at the time. I said, "Oh, thank you very much." We started talking, and that's how the idea of making a publicity film happened. I didn't know at the time that my husband was incredibly a huge railway enthusiast. But when he heard that I'd had a ride in a footplate, he was quite green with jealousy. Anyway, we made a publicity film. And from that, the idea of writing about the railway first started.
What was your approach to researching the railway's history, given that you wanted to cover such a large swath of time?
Well, it's interesting because it didn't stay that. I didn't envisage it as a whole series. I think if I had, I'd have probably thought, oh no, I'm not going to even touch this. I actually don't, as I write, I don't tend to plan too much. It's probably not the way one should do it, but it works for me. I actually started writing the last scene of the wartime episode um, just in a notebook when we'd broken down. The car had broken down when we were on our way to do some filming on the Severn Valley Railway. I can't remember why I had the idea at the time. I wrote that, and then of course I had to start researching backwards to kind of fit this scene I'd written into a story. So that's how I started that. Once I started, I got really hooked, fascinated by the period. Then I read a book about the railway navvies, and I thought this is really, really interesting about all the people who came and actually worked on building the railways. And so I did some research, and that's how the whole thing expanded. It's, as I say, it's not a linear way of writing at all.
It must have been a lot of fun, though, as you're uncovering these different eras and seeing what life was like, both in terms of how the company was doing, but also socially. That's something that really struck me when watching the show, is how
Mm.
this is about, there's so many layers. There's the layers of your primary protagonist, who are children, and then there's the layer of their family, then there's the layer of the company, and the layer of society as a whole, and what the country is going through. So it must be
Mm.
fascinating to look at each of those for each of the different times that you eventually decided you wanted to cover as part of this.
That's very interesting. Yes, I mean, for me, the main interest are the characters. Apart from anything else, I love writing dialogue, and I love how relationships develop through the dialogue and what's said, and in fact, as much as anything, what's not said, what's just, the subtext really. So for me, I start with the characters. You place the characters in a certain situation, you do your research into that period, and that's what's really exciting because then that gives you more ideas. And then that you think, oh yes, I'd like to weave that into the story as well. And oh, that's really interesting. I'll weave that into the story. And that is how, for me, it develops. And yes, as you said, it's it builds up a sort of richness. There are various different layers. Um, yes, and of course you put. Um, I don't place think right. I'm going to place my characters in a particular setting. I find that the characters dictate the story in a way. There are times when you've got to almost rein them back because they get carried away. But for me, part of the excitement of creating is to say, I have this character, A, given that situation, for example, Andy, whose whole life very secure, very comfortable, knows where he stands, knows the railway timetable backwards. That's his life. Suddenly, what happens when all that's turned upside down? And how does he respond to that? And that's what I find exciting.
I feel like when I've researched what a creative process is for a number of authors, that idea of character driven is so important, having them be relatable. So, looking at the first two stories, which focus on the construction of the Severn Valley Railway and are set with the navvies, this is already a long time ago from 1980. This is not the 1850s,
60s.
1860s. Thank you. So
Yeah.
this is 1860s. So it's already a long way away from 1980, let alone
Mm-hmm.
here we are in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make characters who are in a very different society from what we live in now relatable?
Interesting. I don't know. You do your research, you try and think yourself into that character. Um, I found out, for example, that they lived in what were called shanty towns. They just threw up some rough buildings to live in. And you think that must have been pretty horrible. And their life revolved around what they called the Tommy shop, which is like the sort of pub, the meeting room where they got paid, where they spent all their money on drink and so on. So a lot of it at that period is obviously doing the research, but then that leads on to different things. What I think is really, really important as an author, if you're writing something historically, is to get the period right, to do your research, to actually find out that, no, people didn't have mobile phones. No, they didn't have telephones. How did they travel? How long would it have taken them to get from A to B? All that is very interesting, and that can bleed into the story in a sense.
Part of what's tricky with a setting like that is that when you look at the culture of railway construction, whether it be the navies building this particular railway or even something like the transcontinental railroad here in the US, it's clear that these were very rough and tumble societies. They were very you know, big burly men who from different backgrounds, who wouldn't always agree with each other, sometimes from different cultures. And there's a lot of dark elements with that. And here you are wanting uh, to look at this world through the eyes of a young man. How do you convey the elements of that world without it getting too dark and keeping your audience in mind?
I think for a start, I don't write thinking there is a child in front of me and I'm writing for that child. Um, I think I've probably never grown up. I tend to look at things possibly from a childlike perspective. I think children can take all kinds of dark issues if they're comfortable and if they know that the result is going to be acceptable to them. I'm just thinking of fairy stories that usually end up, yes, the Wicked Witch does get her comeuppance. I think one can tackle dark subjects for children. I don't actually think that's a problem. I've never found that a problem with anything I've written, with the feedback from children of anything I've written. In a way, almost at times the opposite. As soon after God's Wonderful Railway went out, I was signing books on the railway, and a little child came up to me and said, I was just explaining, he said, to my dad, that Victoria Bridge, this, when we went over it in the train, this was a train where John Grant actually fell down, fell off. And you think, yeah, in a sense, one part of him has really, really believed it. And that's actually, from my point of view, quite successful. It's also quite humbling because you do realize you have a huge responsibility. Writing's a very lonely occupation. You're doing it on your own. Unless you get that feedback afterwards. I was amazed at the response to God's Wonderful Railway. Um, Around 5 million people watched it, which was huge in those times. Probably still quite big now, actually, with all the plethora of television companies. And it was quite, it really brought me up with a jolt to realize that I have a responsibility when I'm writing, because children, on one level, they really believe it. Mind you, I think that's also true with adults. If they're really carried up in a film or television, they really believe it on one level.
Historical fiction, sometimes those characters are wholly of the author's imagination. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, such as in the second group of stories, or the third and fourth episodes in the series, um, Clear Ahead, you have mostly fictional characters, but a couple of real ones, without getting into spoilers. How do you balance that mixture? And if you're incorporating somebody who was real, ensuring that you're portraying them in a way that feels true to who they were, especially if they're no longer alive to talk to about their experience or how you wish to adapt them in part.
Well, it's very interesting, Nick, because the only two real characters who really existed in in the stories, and that was John Fowler, who was the designer of Victoria Bridge, and Henry Bridgman, who was the engineer. Every single character in Clear Ahead was totally fictional.
Hmm.
Obviously, I made them so you thought that they were, so you thought they're real people.
Well, it's to your credit. Well, I'm thinking of a particular special guest, with with regards to a special guest with a special train.
Hmm.
Um, but the
Oh, the king. That was the only
yes,
one. The king. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh,
but it's to your credit that you are able to, in the context of those stories, mesh them to the point where somebody who wasn't doing their homework couldn't tell who's the fictional character and who's the real one.
yeah. I mean, it was only the king. I think actually that question could be better put to something like the really popular series The Crown, because this is a very personal thing, rather have take issue with making up fictional stories about living people, especially living people like royalty who can't answer back. But that's a very personal thing.
So I have to admit that the Clear Head story of the three is probably my personal favorite. In
Mhm.
watching the episodes, because I haven't yet read the book, but in watching the episodes, it's so much a slice of life in that you just have these little things that go on. There's a somewhat major event, but even the major event isn't necessarily the climax of the story as a whole. What details do you look for? How do you go about finding the right details to make something that's really about day-to-day life compelling to a reader like that?
Well, to take Clear Ahead, I wrote it remembering my own first day at work, which wasn't on a railway. It was working for a local council. Uh, and I was in an office and I hadn't any idea where anybody was. People talk a sort of jargon when they're at work, a kind of shorthand. I had no idea. People said, "Oh, just go and get that," and I thought, "What? Where? What?" I don't understand any of this. And I thought of all that I put into the character of George. It wasn't that he was stupid at all. He was very bright. It was just, it was his first day at work. It was all unknown to him. He also had all kinds of other concerns, like he was frightened of his grandfather and he was a big lad and all that sort of thing. Um, but that really was the basis of where I started from to write his that character in his story, the story of George.
It makes it approachable because I think that a lot of us have some sort of experience with being new to an experience. In the case of this story, so George, the primary protagonist, it's his first day being part of the crew under the station master, who's a very strict older gentleman, not entirely unkind, as we come to see, but one who has a very strong belief of this is the way that we do things. This is the Great Western way.
Mm,
And so you watch him as he evolves from sort of fumbling his way around the station to really taking mastery and taking charge of situations that come his way. And that's something that even as an adult, when we think about how we approach a new experience and how we feel inside, whether that comes across externally or not, occurs. Um, and how we ultimately come to feel like we belong when we want to belong in an office or with coworkers.
mm. Yeah, yeah. I don't know about you. I remember my very, very first day at school very well. It was horrible. I remember sitting in the classroom and the teacher calling the register, and all the children were saying present. I remember absolutely feeling sick, thinking, my mummy hasn't given me a present. Why should I give a present to the teacher? Because I didn't know what was being said. So, yes, there are all kinds of situations, I think, throughout our lives we're put in where we don't really know what's going on. And we feel embarrassed, uncomfortable, um, liable to make fools of ourselves, and we probably do. Um, and I think that that's part of human nature. Just one other point, though. You say about the station master, Mr. Jellicoe. Um, I always find it interesting to delve a bit more into the characters. I won't say what happened, but of course he had his own problems, which meant that he behaved in a certain way towards his staff. Quite apart from being, this is the way it's done. Everything's done by the rule book on the Great Western. And a couple of incidents on the Sim Valley Railway I've used throughout the series. One was the incidents in Clear Ahead about the painting of the white line. That there often is a kind of antagonism, you know, could be quite joking, between the station staff, who for them the stations are the important thing, and the drivers, uh, the engine drivers, because for them they're the important thing, and the two are in conflict. As I said, it can be quite amicable, but there is that kind of slight tension, I think, at times. And I found that on the St. Valley Railway and used that in the story.
That's a really good point. That when I watch these episodes, there's nobody that I look at and go, they are they're one sided. Every
Mm.
character that I see, I look at it and I think, oh, I could watch episodes about just them and what their life is like and what their perspective is like. The conflict that emerges because it's natural. It's just different people having different beliefs, different upbringings, different ways of going about getting a job done, and the natural conflict that arises through that. Uh, I think helps to build the organic sense of the story of this slice of life nature that I keep coming back to when I think about it. And I feel like that also really helps it age, as far as that it's not about me versus you. I may end up versus you if we have a disagreement on something, but neither one of us are
Mm.
inherently good or evil. It's just a
Mm.
case of we have different ways of looking at the world. And I love that each of these stories has such a variety of perspectives, even where we're primarily focusing on a child and they
Mm.
are the ones that we follow through the story. It's clear that the other people are lived in characters too.
That's very nice of you to say so. I think I've succeeded then. But as I said, it's not a conscious thing. I don't sit down and think, right, so I've got to give it just evolves as part of the creative process, which you can't really explain. I mean, you could go on writing courses and people would tell you the mechanics of it and how to lay out a script. You can't tell somebody how to be a writer. I think that's true in a lot of almost every creative profession. I mean, my husband is an editor. We met both working in the BBC. And Chris was asked once if he'd run a course in creative editing. And he said, I can't really. I can tell you how to do it, how to press the buttons, but I can't actually tell you when is the right moment to cut from one shot to another, because that is, you know, that is something you can't describe. You either have it or you haven't, in a sense, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. It's a intuition thing. Speaking
Mm.
as one who's a filmmaker,
Mm.
there's a certain amount that you can learn as far as how the
Yes.
tools work, and then
Yes.
there's a certain amount of just doing to get the experience and to get the feel of when you make
Yeah.
a particular cut, how you
Yeah.
frame a particular shot based on
Yeah.
mood. The last story, at least the last published story slash one that made it to air, which I have my copy right here, is Fire on the Line.
Mm-hmm.
And this is set during World War II, and our protagonist Andy is a massive railway enthusiast, whose uh, father George, who we followed in the last series of episodes, is now the station master, and we watch as his world is turned upside down, where he goes from loving his little slice of country life, loves his toy train set in his basement, loves knowing when all the trains will run, to the war coming. The schedule's in disarray. He's no longer allowed to go on the footplate or in the yards because of secrecy concerns. And it's very, very dramatic, but I feel like it's very relevant to what's going on right now with the coronavirus. As I'm watching this, and as
Yeah.
I'm reading the book in particular, reading the book too, and I want to touch on the differences between reading the book and watching the episode, but this idea of we're used to life in a particular way,
Mm.
and then there's this force that comes from outside, and in the case of this story it's the war, but you're not on the front lines, you're not seeing the battles take place, uh, you're seeing the home life and the fear of what could happen, and well, what if it comes to my town, and how does it affect us, with citizens having gas masks and being prepared with air raid drills and keeping a listen out for the siren, uh, and occasionally action does come to the home front. And I think it's safe to say we've been all impacted by the coronavirus. It's incredible how a story that you wrote 40 years ago about a completely different
Mm.
set of time and circumstances has this relevance to what we're going through now, as far as we all are have been disturbed in some way. We've all had our slice of life
Yeah.
changed in some regards. And get how do we make sense of this, and how do we move forward? I think the most poignant line that I read was when Andy asks his father, "Will things ever go back to the way they were?" And his dad answers, "Well, probably not." And
Mm.
I wonder what
It's,
your thoughts are on that.
it's very interesting. Before you started saying that, I was absolutely thinking the same thing, that is very similar to what we're experiencing now with the coronavirus, that our worlds have been turned upside down. I mean, some people have suffered bereavements, other people have suffered um, members of family in hospital and they can't even go and see them. I mean, it's other people have lost their jobs. It's been huge, 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 massive change. And in fact, when the virus, the first lockdown in this country happened, I was thinking it was very similar to the Second World War, that people didn't know whether they were going to survive the night. They didn't know whether they were going to be bombed, as you said, or gassed or whatever. And the future is so uncertain. And I wanted to bring into the story the fact that it actually came right into Andy's life in the form of this evacuee, Alice, who not only his parents took in, but she took over his room as well. And he wasn't given any advance notice of it. It just happened. Um, and that awful sense of where am I? What is the world that I've known? You know, where is certainty? Um, I think certainly, I mean, that was obviously a big part of the story, but it's very interesting that it's a very big part now of what we're all experiencing. And then, of course, at the end, without giving any more away, his world is completely turned upside down. You know, all the certainties that he thought he knew have gone. And it is, how do you cope with it? And very difficult to cope with it as a child, I think. I think that's true today for children, actually.
In reading it, what I loved about reading it, so I watched all of the episodes of the series
Hmm.
first,
Hmm.
and then I read this book, which I have nearly finished. What I love about each, I feel like sometimes there's a case of that there's a superiority of one medium over another. Either the book was great because it had so much detail and the movie was truncated, or the movie was better because it could really realize these ideas that the book wasn't able to articulate well, whatever the case may be. In the case of comparing Fire on the Line, the book versus the episodes, what I love about the episodes is seeing this world realized, seeing the steam locomotives moving, the interactions between the characters, and that sense of I'm back as life was 80 years ago. What I love about the book is that I can see into Andy's mind more clearly,
Mm.
because the TV series doesn't have an omniscient narrator or
Mm.
somebody to say, well, this is what Andy's thinking at this point in time. So you're
Mm.
just watching him in the world and kind of having to interpret what people are saying based on facial expression or what they say.
Mm.
There's something interesting about reading the book and getting a little bit more of a sense of, well, what is he thinking when Alice is introduced into his world? What is his specific thought process, and how is he looking at this situation in ways that one doesn't get from watching an actor, no matter how good they are? What do you see when you look at the finished TV series and you look at the books that have been published? What do you see as the merits of each?
Well, I wrote, it's very interesting. I wrote the TV series first. So primarily, it was a script. I then wrote the books based on the series afterwards. As I said earlier, it's a slightly odd way around. Um, I find descriptions quite hard to write. Uh, for me, as I said, dialogue is the interesting thing. What is very interesting, of course, in the book is, as you said, is being able to get inside somebody's head. And I think for me, the most interesting writing I do is when I write a monologue for the stage, which I've done a couple, because then you can get right inside the person's head, but you're writing dialogue. I think there are merits to both. I think you can get more background information, obviously, in the book. I think you can have people's thoughts. You can't have a bubble, going out the side of their head when you're watching it. Um, it's different. I mean, they're different disciplines, and they've both got advantages and disadvantages. And it's very difficult to marry the two, other than, as I said, in writing something like a monologue for the stage.
So, since you wrote the book and you were able to give the story a happy ending, hopefully, when you look at the situation we're in now, you see some sort of similar happy ending, at the very least, a sense of we will prevail.
Well, I think so. I think the news the last week or so about the vaccines is hugely encouraging. And I just think that all credit should go to scientists who normally take 10 years to develop a vaccine. They've done it in what, 8, 10 months. Um, but I think, having read, and watched on television some of the scientists' views, they're saying this isn't going to be the last one. And if you think about it, it's quite interesting. In the aftermath of the First World War, there was the Spanish flu, which I think killed about 50 million people. I mean, a staggering number of people died with the Spanish flu. And in a sense, you could say we are so fortunate living as we do for two reasons. One is that we can develop and have developed vaccines, but also I think that we have the advantage of technology. I mean, how many, we're communicating on Zoom. How many people who have been lonely, imprisoned in their homes, who have got at least a telephone or Skype or Zoom or something else, so that at least they can keep in touch. Just think how terrible it must have been, even 30 years ago if this had happened. So, I mean, I think rather as George and his dad said, when in answer to the question, will things ever be the same? I don't think they'll ever be completely the same, because everything changes. Quite apart from anything, the world is probably in serious financial debt. So I don't think it'll be the same, but it's a question of whether you sort of give up or you find ways out of it. And I think it's very interesting, talking about the pandemic, that certainly in this country, the village where I live, it's almost been a polarization. There's been a huge amount of people helping other people, raising money for charity. I mean, both Chris and I are in our 70s, and to begin with, and even now, we prefer not to go out shopping. And we've got wonderful neighbours who we've only got to know really well, because they're immediately getting in touch with us saying, can we do anything? Can we get you food? I think there's been a huge outpouring of that. I think there's also been, sadly, the opposite side with, people behaving irresponsibly, badly, conspiracy theories all over the place. You're going to get that. I think it's like anything. It's a two-edged sword. There's good and there's bad.
Which is probably not unlike how people felt with World War II when it outbreak. It's so funny watching Marge, the sister of Andy in Fire on the Line, talking about how she doesn't believe that a war is going to happen. And of course, we, the viewer, know it is going to happen
Mm,
and it is going to be a major thing. But
mm.
it's interesting. And that's why I'm curious to see your perspective, is because when you look at history over periods of time and you recognize that any period is just that, it has an eventual end, it moves on to another period, moves on to another era of time, that things change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but it's there's always something to be gleaned from each. And I think that's what I
Yes.
find interesting about historical fiction, is how we can look
Mm.
back and learn. We can learn both from historical research, but also that which you can't do solely through just articulating what specifically happened point for point.
Well, yes, because also we can look at things like the Second World War from the hindsight of, well, we know what happened. If you're living through it, as we're living through COVID now, you don't know what the outcome is. And that makes it very much more frightening. If you're living in at the time of the plague, the Black Death, um, you wouldn't know whether you're ever going to come out of it. In a sense, we don't still know whether we can come out of it. But that puts a different perspective. It's certainly a different perspective when you're writing, because you're writing and trying to get into that period when they don't know what's going to happen, when Andy doesn't know what is going to happen. Is he going to have to be moved from the railway? Is he going to have to go away somewhere? So it's quite easy to write or to think about events in history with a hindsight. Well, it all turned right in the end, or it didn't turn right in the end, or at least we know what happened. We don't know what happened. We don't know what's going to happen, in an hour, anytime.
You write these first three stories, and then you, as you said, wrote an additional two, the fourth covering the Beaching Axe era when the line was
Mm-hmm,
closed, and the
mm-hmm.
fifth about the preservation movement. The first obvious question is, will we get to see those stories at some point in the future realized, even if just as written books? But moving beyond
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
could you provide us a little bit of insight as to the the arcs that you were looking at with each, as far as the movement of the and continuation of the story through those?
Well, it's quite interesting, Nick, because since the DVD came out, which I've been trying to get the BBC to bring out for nearly 40 years now, and it's great they have. I've had a huge response all over the world, which has been absolutely lovely. And I was thinking, right, okay, at least I should write the other two stories as a book. Um, they wouldn't stand alone. You'd have to repeat the series or remake the series to have the whole 13 episodes, like the whole span of the railway's history from its building in the 1860s to its heyday, through wartime, through closure to reopening, bringing it round in full circle. Um, so I thought, right, okay, I could do it as a book. So I thought, right, got the scripts up in the loft. Had a look in the loft. So far, I can only find the scripts for the last story, not the one before that. But we're planning to clean out the loft, and somewhere they'll be there. And I do hope to write it up as a book, because it
We
would be nice to complete that.
It would be lovely to see it come full circle, especially because preservation has only increased internationally
Mm,
since movements like the Severn Valley Railway took hold. That actually ties in with a question that one of our listeners asked. Sam Ryan poses, if the series were to be remade with a brand new cast, potentially bigger budget and improved effects, how would you feel about it?
Oh, yes, please. Especially if they did the end of it. Yeah, I'd be delighted. I mean, I thought the cast were extremely good. I thought they really, what was really interesting was to see some of the characters. When I actually saw the series, I thought, gosh, did I write that? Because they brought, a, that is their craft. That's their expertise. That's their creative element. They put a creative element into what I'd written that I hadn't even realized I'd written. Um, an example was Mr. Jellicoe, the station master. When I won't explain for anybody who's not seen it, but there was a depth to Richard Pearson's portrayal of Mr. Jellicoe that I had no idea when I was writing those lines, which is interesting. But no, I mean, I'd love it. Obviously, I'd love it to be done. I can tell you right. The closure of the line is going to be called the end of the line. Would you believe? And then the reopening was going to be called Weekend Return, and the closure of the line is Andy's son, who has in the era of the 60s, no interest at all in railways, wants to be a pop musician, a star, and then the last story was about Angie's granddaughter and how together they helped start the preservation movement. So
Oh,
that's in a
that's
nutshell.
sweet. I like that, man. That makes me all the more eager to see it come to light someday.
I
I know
just have to
that.
go into the loft.
Yeah, as somebody who's embarking on his own house cleaning, I know that that could be fairly daunting. So we collectively at the
Yeah,
Roundhouse wish you the best of luck in your loft cleaning.
thank you.
I know that primarily your role with this was to as writing the screenplay, and that you weren't necessarily heavily involved in the production side. Did you get to witness the production at all?
Yeah, I went out, to watch filming on a couple of occasions, which was quite interesting. And I was also involved, in a sense, but very much at third hand, because it ended up that my husband, who was a drama editor, uh, film at the time, and he retired as supervising editor of drama at in the Midlands at Pebble Mill. Um, he ended up as the editor of the series, the film editor, which was quite interesting because when the executive producer, Anna Hume, who incidentally a few years before had introduced Chris and I, so it was all quite, close. We took her to Sun Valley Railway because she was looking for locations, and she sat in our lounge and she said, "Yeah," she said, "what I really need is somebody who knows as much about preserved railways as about, you know, film. Can you think of anybody?" And so we looked at each other and said, right, the only one we can think of is Chris. And it ended up that Chris edited the series, which was lovely. It was lovely for me anyway. I don't know about for Chris.
So after 40 years of patient, or not so patient waiting, I guess it was more like 37 or 38, been pushing the BBC hard. Finally, that DVD release comes. Finally, the opportunity to share this with a wider audience, such as myself, folks who had never had the chance to see it before. What has been the reception from other people who are getting to know it for the first time now that it's 40 years after it was originally aired?
It's been really good. I think there are a lot of people who've actually, their children now watching it, which is quite interesting. Their children who are probably the age of the children in the series who are watching it. And they're sort of pretty hooked on it as well, which is good. I think also because partly because the series is about about the railway. As you said, there are many layers to the story, but partly it's about the railway. And now there seems to be almost more interest in heritage railways, in steam preservation, than there was in the 80s, which I think is quite interesting. I think it's the fact that people want to look back. There's this yearning for nostalgia. But I think that's not just the older generation who might have seen it when it went out and think, oh gosh, I'd love to see it again. But I think it's also from younger people because they look on a different, okay, it's an idealized world, but it's a different world, which is perhaps simpler, calmer, I don't know, less frenetic, I don't know.
The format that you've taken of looking at a particular railway over a period of time, one of the things I emerged from seeing the show is, oh, this could absolutely be done again, and it could be done not just as a remake with the Severn Valley, but this type of approach could be done with a whole host of railroads around the world that have gone through sometimes similar arcs and sometimes different ones, but ones where you could look at different periods of history. So for somebody who wants to embark on being an author, being a children's author, trying to take history and making it relatable as you did, what advice would you give them?
That's a tall order. Um, do a bit of research for a start and get something that interests you to sort of hook the story on, to start the story on. Um, I'll give you a totally different example of that. I wrote a book called The Shakespeare Connection because my other passion is Shakespeare, and we live not far from Stratford upon Avon. And Chris and I were sitting in McDonald's restaurant at the time, uh, in the main street. And I looked up and I suddenly thought, and I say I went out of this shop with my hamburger in my hand, and all the shops opposite, Marks and Spencer's, all the shops, they suddenly dissolved and they went back into Shakespeare's time. And when I looked down, I found I was holding a meat pie and I was dressed in Elizabethan costume. And that was the start of a series, of a book, which sadly has never been made into a series, so I did write the scripts and one time it's going to be possible, about a lost play of Shakespeare's. So you sort of need something to kind of capture imagination, uh, and then you work from there, which has taken us a long way away from railroads. If you get the idea.
Sometimes it's good to be taken away from railroads to come back to them. I think
Yeah.
that the fact that God's Wonderful Railway is set around a railway, but looks beyond just the trains and just the machines and looks at the lives of people who aren't directly connected with it, to contextualize everything makes the railway itself richer because then it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It
Mm,
exists in a world. And I feel
mm,
like anytime you're creating a story, you want to create a world that goes with it.
mm. Yeah, a real world. Yeah. It was quite interesting because after God's Wonderful Railway went out, there were a lot of adults who wrote into BBC and said, why isn't there something for adults about steam railways, a drama series? And the BBC commissioned me to write a 6 50-minute adult drama series based on railways, which I wrote and called it Steam. And it was literally going into production. There was a producer and everything, and there was a change of channel controller at the BBC, and he wanted a long-running soap, and that's how EastEnders started. Don't know, you probably heard of that or not. And my series was never made. And then they felt bad about it, the BBC, so they gave me back the copyright and paid me, which was nice. And I then sold it to uh, Welsh television company S4C. And they were literally about to go. I rewrote it, setting it in Wales, which was actually very easy to do because the Great West. It was still on the Great Western Railway. I mean, Great Western Railway is very much in Wales, and the before it was going into production, there was suddenly an edict came down that they would only accept stuff from genuine Welsh writers. This is absolutely true. And I said, well, my husband's half Welsh, a name like Rowlands, and they said no. So they paid me, but that's never been done, which is sad. So if anybody in the States or anywhere else wants a 50-minute drama series for adults based on railways, I've got the scripts.
Oh, that sounds like a gold mine right there. That sounds like an absolute gold mine right there. Man, your attic. Man, I want to. I want to see this attic because I mean, you've got the two remaining stories for God's Wonderful Railway. You've got the Steam series, and then you have the non-railway stuff. And I feel like now that I'm getting to love your railway stuff, I'd like to see that too. So, yes, the treasure trove of a loft continues to give, but it's so
Yeah.
it's great that you've held on to that and clearly built upon the work that you've done with other ideas. I'm sort of curious. So after you moved on from God's Wonderful Railway and you had that success, how did you take what you learned from the process of creating that, and maybe the process of seeing how that turned into a television series, and use that when you then went on to write other books, even though they weren't necessarily railway fiction?
Well, soon after that, I wrote another children's television series called Letty, which was actually, and that was made for television. And that was based on a friend of mine who was disabled. Her mother had a form of, I don't know if you know about thalidomide, which a lot of pregnant women took, and they then had disfigured children in some way. Anyway, my friend, her legs never developed, and I wrote a series about a disabled girl in a wheelchair who lives in a children's home, who sets up a detective agency. And I wrote it from the point of view of basing it on my friend, because it's not the fact she's disabled, although the disability obviously helped form her character, but more the kind of gutsy person she was and still is. Why shouldn't she set up a detective agency? What's the problem? So she's in a wheelchair. So I don't know that writing God's Wonderful Railway, apart from being able to sort of develop my skills as a writer, if you like, knowing more what works, what doesn't work, helped. But that was, for me, script writing for television is the most exciting. I've written a lot of books, had them published, and I've been very fortunate. But it's writing, I just feel that in dialogue and in relationships, that is what it's all about. You can put people in situations, but it's the relationships between people. How, if you've noticed, if you're holding a conversation with people, generally people aren't listening to what you're saying. They might catch a word or two, and then they want to come in with their take on it. And I put that in very much in the scenes in the third story between Marge and her mother. They don't actually listen to each other. They just catch on to one word. Oh yeah, that reminds me, to go off on a tangent. And I just think it's fascinating how people actually don't listen to each other.
It's true.
Not like the conversation we're having, of course.
Of course. But there are so many different ways in which people interact, and it's lovely to explore those different interactions through the characters that you create. My last question for you is, now that you wrote these series of stories, most of which were made into a television series, now it's on DVD, so it's preserved for future generations to see. What makes you most grateful that this vision of yours and these ideas became realized into something that now people across the world get to enjoy and learn from?
Oh, it's lovely. I mean, uh, I had a cousin who wrote a book. She wouldn't let me read it. She said she's written it. It's up in her bedroom wardrobe, and that was it. And I said, "Do you not want to get it published?" And she said, "No, no, no. I'm quite happy. I've written it, and that's fine. That she's got that out of her system." For me, it is. I can write it, and that's good, and that's exciting. But then I want to share it. I want to share it on television. I want to share it as books. So it's not just. It's not just. It's my baby, but I want to share it with others. And of course, another interesting thing is that when you have a book published, by and large, it's pretty much as you've written it. Editor might make some suggestions, you might change a bit here and there. When you write something for television or for films, you're going to have a whole host of other people working on it, and you need to be prepared for that. And I think it was helpful that I worked in television because there are a lot of creative people coming at it from different angles, like the actors, the director, the camera operator, and so on. And they all want to put their mark on it. If it's a strong enough story, I think it'll survive, and it can be improved hugely, as I said about the actor Richard Pearson, who played the part of the station master. Um, it can, on the other hand, drown it in lots and lots of different people's takes on it, and it turns out to be nothing. It could be very disappointing, but I'm willing to take that chance because I think it's exciting that other people take something I've written as a starting point and then bring their creative talents to it. Chris, on the other hand, is at the other end because he likes to be at the end where you're doing the editing.
There's room for everyone as far as their creative approach is concerned.
Absolutely, yeah.
Avril, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse and
It's been great.
sharing your experience with creating God's Wonderful Railway and the creative writing process in general and how you tie in historical fiction. It's been a lovely conversation. And I personally can't thank you enough for having written this because I feel like it speaks to me and my love, not just of railways, but history in general. And I think that I'm not alone in saying that. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great to talk to you. I've really enjoyed it.